in the year 1320, when the Adriatic sun gilded the warehouses of Venice in golden light. A grain merchant named Marco spent his days ensuring that thousands of souls would have bread for their tables. The massive stone warehouses along the canal held the heartbeat of the Republic itself, grain from distant lands, carefully stored and measured, waiting to feed the city. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will take us to the grand grain warehouses of Venice in the year 1320, where we will follow Marco through the quiet rhythms of his work. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Marco was 41 years old, his sun-weathered hands marked by years of handling grain sacks, his graying hair tied back from a face lined with the patient wisdom of someone who understood that good work cannot be hurried. He moved through the warehouse with the measured pace of a man who had performed the same tasks for decades, each motion economical and deliberate. The morning had begun as it always did. Marco arrived before the sun fully cleared the rooftops, when the warehouse was still cool, and the air held the gentle scent of stored grain, a smell like sunshine and summer combined. The stone walls seemed to exhale this fragrance as the temperature began to climb. He paused for a moment in the doorway, breathing deeply, feeling the familiar contentment settle over him like a familiar cloak. His first task was always the same: inspecting the uppermost storage level. The wooden beams that supported the grain sacks were ancient, weathered to the color of honey by generations of Venetian merchants before him. Marco ran his calloused fingers across the nearest beam, checking for the soft spots that might indicate rot or weakness. His inspection was thorough and unhurried. There was no urgency in this work, only the steady, careful attention of a man who took pride in preventing problems before they could arise. The grain sacks themselves were arranged in precise rows, each one aligned with meditative precision. Marco knew these sacks the way a musician knows a familiar instrument. He understood their weight, their subtle variations, the way they settled differently depending on the grain variety and the season. Some held wheat from the Adriatic coast, others barley from lands to the north, still others rye that had traveled through mountain passes to reach this Venetian warehouse. He began his inspection by moving slowly down the first row, checking the cordage that bound each sack. His fingers worked methodically, testing each knot, ensuring that no fiber had weakened from moisture or time. The work was repetitive, yes, but it was the sort of repetition that allowed his mind to settle into a state of deep peace. His hands knew what to do. His attention could rest on the simple sensations around him: the texture of the cord, the steadiness of his own breathing, the distant sound of water lapping against the canal walls far below. By mid-morning, the warehouse had grown warmer, and the quality of light had shifted. The sun now poured through the high windows in thick, honey-colored beams, illuminating the dust motes that drifted through the air like tiny, lazy travelers. Marco paused in his work and stood for a moment in one of these beams, feeling the warmth on his face and shoulders. The sensation was deeply comfortable, the sort of warmth that came naturally, without effort or strain. His assistant, Tommaso, was a young man of 19 years old, recently apprenticed to the warehouse work. Tommaso moved through the space with the earnest energy of youth, still learning the rhythms of the job. Marco watched him work with quiet approval. There was no need for harsh words or urgent corrections. Tommaso was learning, as all apprentices learned, through careful observation and patient repetition. "The northern grain," Marco said gently, without urgency, "settles differently than the coastal wheat. Do you notice how the sacks shift slightly over the first month? This is normal. It means the grain inside is settling, becoming more compact. It is not a problem, it is the natural way of things." Tommaso nodded, absorbing this knowledge, and Marco returned to his work. The morning continued in this peaceful manner, one task following naturally into the next. There was a rhythm to the warehouse that had nothing to do with clocks or urgency. There was the rhythm of the tides outside, which influenced the dampness and temperature of the space. There was the rhythm of the seasons, which determined what grain arrived in what quantities. There was the rhythm of the city's needs, which rose and fell like breathing. By early afternoon, Marco made his way down to the ground level, where large wooden bins stood ready to receive measured portions of grain. These bins were works of craftsmanship themselves, fitted together with precision, their wood worn smooth by decades of use. The air at this level was different, cooler, and filled with an even richer concentration of the grain scent. It was the sort of air that made a person want to slow down, to move carefully, to let the mind drift like the dust motes in the upper-level sunlight. This was the measuring work, the task that required Marco's most focused attention, though his attention was a kind of focused peace rather than tension. Each merchant who came to purchase grain needed a specific quantity, measured precisely. Marco used a large wooden measure, calibrated carefully to portion out the grain. His movements were steady and deliberate. Scoop, level, pour. Scoop, level, pour. The rhythm was hypnotic in its simplicity and purpose. As he worked, Marco thought about all the bread that would be made from this grain. He thought about the families in Venice who would sit down to their evening meal and break bread made from grain that had passed through his hands. He thought about the bakers, many of whom he knew by sight, who would receive this grain and transform it through their own patient labors into something nourishing and warm. The thought brought him a deep sense of satisfaction. This was his part in the great tapestry of the city. It was not a dramatic role. It required no great intelligence or courage. It required only steady attention, careful work, and the kind of patience that comes from understanding that good work cannot be rushed. Marco was deeply at peace with his place in this pattern. The afternoon wore on. More merchants came and departed with their measured portions. Marco greeted each one with courtesy and recognition. There was no hurrying, even when multiple people needed service at once. The work expanded or contracted to fill the available time, and Marco moved through it all with the same unhurried grace. By late afternoon, when the angle of the sun had shifted and the shadows in the warehouse had grown longer and deeper, Marco began the work of recording the day's activities. He kept careful records in a leather-bound ledger, noting what had been received, what had been measured and sold, what remained. The work was meticulous, requiring him to focus on the small marks he made with his quill, but it was also deeply satisfying. The ledger was a record of order, of care taken, of responsibility fulfilled. As he made his final notes, the bells of the nearby basilica rang out the hour for Vespers, the evening prayer service. The sound resonated across the water and through the stone walls of the warehouse, a familiar anchor point in the day's rhythm. Marco set down his quill and stepped back from the ledger. The day's work was complete. Everything had been attended to. Everything was as it should be. He stepped out of the warehouse into the late afternoon air. The canal waters reflected the amber and rose colors of the sky. The city was beginning its transition into evening, the urgent pace of the day giving way to something more contemplative. Marco walked slowly along the warehouse wall, running his hand along the weathered stone, feeling the warmth that the sun had imparted to the ancient surface. Tomorrow would bring the same tasks. There would be inspection and measurement and record keeping. There would be the same steady rhythm, the same opportunities for careful attention. And this, Marco thought, was exactly as it should be. This constant, this reliable rhythm, this meaningful work done well, this was a kind of beauty that the rushing world often failed to notice. Marco made his way back into the warehouse as the light began its final transformation. The golden afternoon glow had deepened to amber, and the quality of the air had shifted subtly, becoming cooler as the day released its warmth into the evening sky. He moved through the familiar space with the ease of someone whose feet knew every uneven stone, every corner, every threshold. His evening task was one of simple maintenance. Before he departed each day, Marco walked through every level of the warehouse, ensuring that all was secure and prepared for the night. It was a ritual he performed without thinking, the same way he might breathe or blink. His hands checked locks on grain storage compartments. His eyes scanned the wooden beams for any sign of movement or settling. His attention drifted through the space like the gentlest of breezes, noticing everything and rushing at nothing. On the second level, he paused by one of the high windows. The view from here stretched across the rooftops of Venice toward the lagoon, where the water had turned the color of lavender in the fading light. Small boats drifted peacefully across the surface, their work for the day largely complete. Marco stood for a long moment, watching the boats move with the current, moving without effort or urgency, simply allowing themselves to be carried by forces larger than themselves. He thought, as he often did at this hour, about his own father, who had also been a grain merchant. His father, 43 years old at the time of his final illness, had spent his entire life in warehouses like this one, learning the subtle languages of grain storage and merchant practice. On his deathbed, his father had taken young Marco's hand. Marco had been only 17 years old then and had said simply, "The work teaches you if you let it. Pay attention. The grain will tell you what it needs." Marco had never fully understood those words until much later, after years of his own patient work in the warehouses. But now, at 41 years old, with 2 decades of careful practice behind him, he understood completely. The grain did teach. It taught through the way it settled, the way it responded to moisture and temperature, the way it moved almost imperceptibly as it adjusted to its new environment. To work with grain was to listen to a very old language, one that had been spoken in warehouses and granaries and stores for countless generations. He descended to the ground floor once more, where the measuring bins waited in their orderly arrangement. The air here retained more of the day's warmth, and the grain scent seemed even more concentrated, even more soothing. Marco paused before each bin, checking that the wooden structures remained sound, that the levels of stored grain were as they should be. His hands moved slowly over the smooth wood, feeling the accumulated wear of decades of use. The wear was not a sign of weakness or decline. Rather, it was a record of faithful service, of work well done across generations. One of the bins held a particularly old supply of barley grain that had arrived in early spring and had been carefully stored for use during the leaner months to come. Marco opened the bin's access door and reached in to take a handful of the barley grains. They felt warm and solid in his palm, substantial and real. He brought the handful to his nose and breathed in deeply. The scent was rich and complex. It spoke of the earth where the barley had grown, of the seasons that had nurtured it, of the long journey it had traveled to arrive in this Venetian warehouse. He let the grains fall slowly back into the bin, watching them cascade like a small waterfall of tan and gold. The simple act of watching grain fall was somehow deeply peaceful. There was no resistance, no hurrying. The grains simply moved according to the laws of nature, and in that movement was a kind of perfect order. Tommaso appeared in the warehouse entrance, his young face flushed from the day's work. The apprentice was 19 years old, with the kind of earnest energy that came from wanting to do well and not yet being entirely confident in his abilities. "Master Marco," Tommaso called out, his voice carrying across the empty warehouse. "I have completed the organizing of the north storage area as you instructed." "Well done," Marco replied, his voice calm and approving. "Come, let us inspect together." The two made their way up the wooden stairs to the northern storage area. Tommaso had indeed performed his work carefully. The sacks were arranged in proper order, the cordage was secure, and the area had been swept clean of debris. Marco moved along the rows, checking details that Tommaso might have overlooked, but his inspection was gentle and instructive rather than critical. "You see here," Marco said, pointing to a section of sacks near the wall, "how these sacks have shifted slightly from where they were positioned 3 days ago. This is natural. The grain inside is still settling. In another week, they will have shifted perhaps an inch more, and then they will remain stable for months. This is not something to be concerned about. It is simply the nature of grain." Tommaso nodded solemnly, absorbing this knowledge. Marco placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "You are learning well," Marco said. "The work requires patience, and you are developing that patience. This is the most important skill in this trade. Hurrying leads to mistakes. Mistakes lead to loss, but careful attention sustained over time leads to reliability and trust. When the merchants of Venice know that their grain is stored with care in my warehouse, they sleep better at night. This is what we provide, not merely storage, but peace of mind." As the evening deepened, Marco and Tommaso completed their final rounds. They checked the seals on doors and windows. They verified that the large iron locks that secured the most valuable grain supplies were fastened securely, and they ensured that all tools had been returned to their proper places. The work was methodical and thorough, yet it carried no sense of burden or haste. It was simply what needed to be done, performed with the same steady care that marked all their work. By the time they stepped out into the Venetian evening, the last light had faded from the sky. The stars were beginning to emerge, and the city had taken on that particular quality that Venice possessed in the evening hours, a sense of ancient peace, of waters and stone and history, all settling together into restful quiet. "Tomorrow," Marco said to Tommaso as they stood on the waterside path, "I want you to begin learning the measurement work. It requires precision and attention, but I believe you are ready. We will begin slowly with small quantities, and you will learn through practice." Tommaso's face brightened visibly at this news. To move from simple organizing and maintenance work to the more central task of measuring grain was a significant step in his apprenticeship. "I am grateful for the opportunity, Master Marco," the young man said earnestly. "The opportunity is earned," Marco replied, "through the care you show in your current work. You have demonstrated that care. Now you will extend it into new areas. This is how learning happens in a trade. You begin with foundation work, you master it, and then you move forward to more complex tasks." They parted ways at a small bridge that crossed one of Venice's narrower canals. Tommaso made his way toward the apprentice's lodgings, while Marco took the longer path that led toward his own home. The walk through the evening streets was a time of transition, a gradual shift from the day's focused work into the quieter rhythms of the evening and the coming night. The streets of Venice at this hour were sparsely populated. A few merchants were closing their shutters for the night. A woman carrying a basket of flowers made her way toward the market area, likely preparing for the next morning's sales. The sound of music drifted from somewhere nearby, a lute being played by someone unseen, the notes falling into the evening air with a kind of aching beauty. Marco's home was a modest apartment above a small ground-floor room that served as his office and secondary storage area. He climbed the narrow stairs and entered into the familiar space. An oil lamp sat on the shelf near the door, and he lit it using the flint and steel that he kept for this purpose. The lamp's flame caught and steadied, casting warm, moving light across the modest furnishings of his home. The space was clean and orderly, reflecting the same careful attention that Marco brought to his warehouse work. A narrow bed, neatly made, occupied one corner. A small table with 2 chairs stood near the window. Shelves held his collection of ledgers, records spanning more than 20 years of careful work. There was a small hearth where he could prepare simple meals, and beside it, hooks where his work clothing hung. Marco prepared a simple supper for himself: bread and cheese and a small portion of dried figs with a cup of weak ale. He sat at his small table and ate slowly, looking out the window toward the canal below. The evening was settling into true night now. The stars had multiplied, filling the sky with their gentle, unchanging light. As he ate, his mind drifted back through the day's work. He thought about the merchants who had come and gone, the grain that had been measured and distributed, the young Tommaso learning the rhythms of the trade. He thought about his father, dead now these 20 years, and about his father's father before him, grain merchants all, living in warehouses and devoted to the steady work of feeding the city. There was a profound continuity in this work, a sense of connection to all those who had come before and all those who would come after. Marco was merely one link in a very long chain, one link among countless others, all of them engaged in the same quiet devotion to careful, honest work. When he had finished his supper, he prepared the lamp for the night, adjusting it so that it would burn at a low, steady level. He undressed and lay down on his narrow bed, pulling the linen sheet and wool blanket up to his chin. The room was cool and comfortable, the darkness around him deepened by the gentle persistence of the single lamp's light. As he lay there, the events of the day began to soften in his mind. The work, the inspection, the measurement, Tommaso's earnest efforts, the merchant's requirements, all of it faded into a kind of peaceful background hum. His breathing began to slow, matching the rhythm of the water that lapped gently against the canal walls outside his window. He thought about tomorrow and the day after and all the days that would follow. There would be grain to inspect, measurements to take, records to keep. There would be young Tommaso learning his craft, merchants coming and going, the seasons turning, the city's rhythms continuing their ancient patterns. And Marco would be there at 41 years old with his work-weathered hands and his graying hair, bringing the same careful attention, the same patient wisdom to each day's work. This thought brought him deep contentment. There was no need for anything more than this. This was enough. This had always been enough. The water outside continued its gentle lapping against the stone. The stars continued their silent burning in the distant sky. And in his modest room above the canal, Marco's breathing grew even slower and deeper, matching the rhythms of the ancient city around him, as sleep began its own patient approach, moving with the same steady, unhurried grace that marked all the best things in his life. Marco's eyes opened in the pre-dawn darkness, as they did every morning, not from any alarm or urgency, but simply because his body had learned through decades of practice when the warehouse would need him. He lay still for several moments, listening to the particular quality of silence that preceded the city's awakening. The water outside was calm, barely moving, and even the birds had not yet begun their morning songs. He rose slowly, allowing his body to adjust gradually to movement. At 41 years old, he had learned that the day went better when it began with patience rather than haste. He dressed in his work-clothed sturdy linen tunic, wool breeches, leather belt worn soft by years of use. His work-reddened hands moved through these familiar motions without conscious thought. The city was still largely asleep as Marco made his way through the pre-dawn streets toward the warehouse. The air was cool and held the scent of the lagoon salt and seaweed and ancient stone. A few other early workers moved through the darkness, their purposes their own, their movements as unhurried as Marco's own. There was something deeply peaceful about these early hours, a time when the city belonged to those patient enough to rise before it fully awakened. The warehouse was dark and still when he arrived. Marco took a moment to stand in the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust, breathing in the familiar grain scent that never truly left the space. This scent was as much a part of the warehouse as the stone walls or the wooden beams. It was the scent of his life's work, the scent of countless seasons and merchants and daily labors all condensed into one rich, complex aroma. He moved through the warehouse by memory and long familiarity, his path traced by decades of repetition. First, he made his way to the upper levels, where the morning light would eventually reach. The wooden stairs creaked beneath his feet, a sound he had heard so many times that he no longer consciously noticed it, though the sound anchored him in the familiar rhythms of his work. On the uppermost level, he found the first evidence that the night had passed uneventfully. The grain sacks rested in their orderly rows, undisturbed, the cordage secure, everything as it should be. Marco ran his work-weathered hands across the nearest beam, checking by feel for any changes in the wood's texture or stability. The beam was solid and reliable, as it had been yesterday and would be tomorrow. This constant was deeply comforting. He moved along the rows, his inspection methodical and thorough. His graying brown hair had come loose from its binding during the night, and he tucked it back absently as he worked. The morning air was cool on his face and hands, and the sensation was pleasant in a way that required no active appreciation. It was simply part of the texture of the early morning, part of the familiar rhythm of his days. By the time the first true light began to seep through the high windows, Marco had completed his upper-level inspection. Everything was as it should be. No problems had arisen during the night. The grain rested undisturbed, the structure remained sound, the space held its quiet contentment. He descended to the middle level, where the light was just beginning to arrive, painting the stored sacks in gradations of shadow and pale gold. This was one of his favorite times in the warehouse, this moment when night was yielding to day, when the space seemed suspended between two states of being. The light moved slowly across the floor, illuminating dust motes that drifted in their eternal, unhurried descent. On this level, Marco kept a particular section reserved for grain that was nearing the end of its storage period, grain that would soon be measured out and distributed to merchants and bakers throughout the city. He checked these sacks with a special care, noting which supplies were most depleted, which would need to be replenished soon, and which merchants would likely be arriving in the coming days to make their purchases. The work of keeping these mental records was something Marco had developed over years of practice. He did not write down which supplies were running low. Instead, he carried the information in his mind, and in his hands knowledge of the grain's weight and arrangement. When a merchant arrived seeking a particular type of grain, Marco's memory would almost always prove reliable. He would know, without consulting his ledger, whether he had the quantity needed and where it was stored. This kind of knowledge was not learned from books or formal instruction. It was learned through the accumulation of years spent paying careful attention to the specific textures and patterns of one's work. It was learned through patience and repetition, and the development of habits so ingrained that they had become almost instinctive. By full dawn, Tommaso had arrived at the warehouse. The apprentice was 19 years old, and he still approached the work with the earnest intensity of someone determined to prove himself worthy of the opportunity he had been given. This morning, Marco intended to begin the young man's instruction in the measurement work, as he had promised. "Good morning, Master Marco," Tommaso said as he entered, his breath slightly short from the exertion of hurrying through the streets. "I have arrived on time, I hope." "You have arrived at exactly the right moment," Marco replied with quiet approval. "The morning inspection is complete, and now we can begin your training in the measurement tasks. Come with me to the ground level. I will show you how to approach this work." They descended the stairs together, Marco moving with his characteristic steady deliberation, Tommaso following with the eager energy of youth. On the ground level, the measuring bins stood ready, their smooth wooden surfaces gleaming slightly in the early morning light that now filled the warehouse more fully. Marco gestured toward the nearest bin, which contained a supply of barley. "The measurement work requires two things," he said, his voice calm and instructive. "The first is precision. Each merchant who comes to purchase grain has ordered a specific quantity, and we must provide that quantity exactly. The second is care. The grain itself is delicate in its way. It must be handled gently without unnecessary disturbance or damage." He retrieved the measuring vessel, a wooden measure of a specific volume, carefully maintained and regularly checked for accuracy. The measure was simple in design, made from aged wood that had been worn smooth by decades of use. "This measure contains a volume of grain that is standard throughout Venice," Marco explained. "When I fill it and level it carefully, the quantity is always the same. Watch as I demonstrate." Marco approached the barley bin with deliberate slowness. He opened the access door, which moved on its iron hinges with barely a sound. Then, with movements that seemed almost meditative in their careful precision, he inserted the measuring vessel into the grain. "You see how I insert it vertically, without tilting or angling," he narrated. "This ensures that the grain within the measure will be at its natural density, not compressed or loosened by improper technique." He drew the full measure up slowly from the bin, allowing a gentle cascade of excess grains to fall back inside. Then, with a small wooden leveling tool, he scraped across the top of the measure, removing any excess and leaving a perfectly level surface of grain. "Now," he said, "the measure contains exactly the correct quantity. Watch how I transfer it to the merchant's container." With smooth, practiced movements, he poured the measured grain into a waiting burlap sack. The grain flowed like a small, golden stream, and Marco watched it with the absorbed attention of someone who had performed this action thousands of times and still found something meditative in its completion. "This," he said, "is the measure and transfer. In the morning, I might perform this action 100 times or more for different merchants and different quantities. Each time, the work must be done with the same careful precision. Each time, it must be done without hurrying." Tommaso watched with serious attention, his young face concentrated and thoughtful. "Now," Marco continued, "you will practice. I will guide you through the first several measures, and then I will observe while you work independently. There is no need for speed. There is only the need for accuracy and care. Do you understand?" "I do, Master Marco," Tommaso replied. "I am ready to learn." And so the morning progressed in this patient manner. Marco stood beside the young apprentice, guiding his hands, correcting his technique when necessary, offering encouragement and instruction in equal measure. Tommaso's movements were initially uncertain and somewhat clumsy, but with each repetition they grew more steady and assured. By mid-morning, Tommaso was able to perform the measurement and transfer with reasonable accuracy, though still more slowly than Marco's practiced hand. But Marco showed no impatience with the young man's pace. "Speed will come with practice," Marco assured him. "For now, what matters is that you are developing the habit of precision. Speed without precision is merely carelessness. Precision with speed is true skill. We will build toward that skill gradually." As the morning wore on, the first merchants began to arrive. They came with their empty sacks and their specific orders, seeking the grain they needed for their own businesses: bakers who would transform the grain into bread, brewers who would use it to make ale, merchants who would resell it in distant markets. Marco greeted each merchant with courtesy and recognition. He knew most of them by sight and by the specific quantities and grain types they regularly purchased. Some he had been dealing with for years. Others were newer to the trade, but had already established themselves as reliable customers. With each merchant, Marco performed his measurement work with the same careful precision, while Tommaso observed and gradually began to assist. The young apprentice would help measure and pour, would secure the grain in the merchant's sacks, and would make note of the transaction for Marco's records. One merchant in particular arrived around midday, a woman named Elena, who was 36 years old and operated 3 bakeries in different parts of Venice. Elena was one of Marco's most reliable customers, a woman who understood the quality of the grain she purchased and paid fairly for it without haggling. "Good morning, Marco," Elena said as she entered the warehouse, her manner warm and familiar. "I need my usual quantity of the fine wheat and also some of the barley for the hearth bread I've been developing." "Good morning, Elena," Marco replied with genuine pleasure in his voice. "I have both of those supplies prepared. They arrived in excellent condition from the northern merchants, and I have stored them with particular care." As he began to measure out Elena's grain, Marco moved with the same patient deliberation he always brought to this work. His work-reddened hands moved through their familiar motions, filling the measure, leveling it, transferring the grain. But as he worked, he allowed his attention to include Elena as well, taking in the details of how she carried herself, the particular quality of her presence in the warehouse. "Your bakeries are thriving, I hear," Marco said conversationally as he worked. "I encountered one of your customers yesterday, and she spoke very favorably of your bread." "The work is good," Elena replied, "and the customers are loyal. But I am constantly seeking better grain that will allow me to improve my bread further. The quality of the grain is so fundamental to the quality of the final loaf." "It is true," Marco agreed. "The grain carries the story of its growth, the soil where it grew, the seasons that nurtured it. That story remains in the grain, even after it is harvested and dried and stored. A skilled baker can read that story and use it to create something beautiful." Elena nodded, clearly pleased by his understanding of her craft. This was the kind of conversation that Marco found deeply satisfying, the recognition that his work and Elena's work were part of the same larger endeavor, the feeding and nourishing of the city's people. When Elena had received all her grain and departed, Marco turned to Tommaso. "Do you see how the work extends beyond mere measurement and transfer?" Marco asked. The merchant and I have a relationship built over years of fair dealing and mutual understanding. She trusts that the grain I provide is of good quality. I trust that she will use it skillfully. This trust is as much a part of the warehouse work as the physical labor itself. Tommaso nodded solemnly, absorbing this lesson. The afternoon progressed much like the morning had. Merchants came and departed with their grain, their specific needs met with Marco's practiced precision. Tommaso continued his gradual apprenticeship in the measurement work, his movements becoming somewhat more assured and smooth as the day wore on. As the afternoon light began its slow shift toward evening, the stream of merchants diminished. By late afternoon, the warehouse had fallen into a quieter rhythm. Marco began the process of accounting for the day's transactions, making careful notations in his ledger about what had been sold and what remained in storage. The work of record-keeping was something that required Marco's precise attention, but allowed his mind to settle into a meditative state. The careful formation of letters, the accurate notation of quantities, the logical organization of information, all of this was deeply satisfying to him. The ledger was a record not merely of commerce, but of care, a documentation of responsibility fulfilled. As he worked, the light in the warehouse continued its gradual transformation. The golden afternoon glow deepened toward amber, and eventually toward the deeper colors of early evening. The warehouse took on that particular quality it possessed during these transitional hours, a sense of peace and completion, as if the day's work had been sufficient and could now be released into memory. When Marco had completed his record-keeping, he looked up from his ledger and found that Tommaso had settled onto one of the wooden storage benches, his young face peaceful and his eyes half closed. The apprentice was 19 years old, and the day's work had clearly exhausted his still developing strength. Marco felt a gentle warmth toward the young man, a recognition of the effort he was bringing to his apprenticeship. "Tommaso," Marco said gently, not wanting to startle the young man from his half-dreaming state. "Come, let us complete the evening rounds and then you may rest." Tommaso stirred and stood, moving somewhat stiffly after hours of standing and repetitive work. Together, the two made their way through the warehouse, checking locks and seals, verifying that all was secure for the night. The work was familiar and comforting, the same evening rounds that Marco had performed countless times. By the time they stepped out into the Venetian evening, the day had fully transformed into night. The stars were beginning to emerge, and the city had taken on that particular quality of ancient peace that seemed to descend upon it as darkness fell. "You have done well today," Marco said to Tommaso as they stood on the waterside path. "You have shown attention and care in your learning. Continue to bring this same attention to your work, and your skill will develop naturally." "Thank you, Master Marco," Tommaso replied earnestly. "I am grateful for the opportunity to learn the measurement work. I will work to become worthy of your trust." "You are already showing yourself worthy," Marco assured him. "The question is not whether you will succeed, but how quickly you will master the work. That depends only on your continued care and attention." They parted ways, and Marco began his walk home through the Venetian evening. The streets were quieter now, the urgent commerce of the day having given way to the slower rhythms of evening. Lamps were being lit in windows, and the aroma of cooking food drifted from various residences. Marco's mind drifted as he walked, moving through the events of the day without attempting to fix them in memory. The measurement work, Elena's visit, Tommaso's gradual learning, the countless small transactions that had filled the hours, all of it seemed to flow together into a sense of work well done, responsibility faithfully discharged. He climbed the stairs to his modest apartment and lit his evening lamp. The familiar space welcomed him with its orderly arrangement and quiet simplicity. He prepared a light supper much as he had the evening before, bread and cheese and dried fruit, with weak ale. He sat at his small table and ate slowly, feeling the day's work settling into his bones. After his meal, he prepared for the night, changing into the simple sleeping tunic he wore. He lay down on his narrow bed and pulled the linen sheet and wool blanket up around himself. The room was cool and comfortable, and the darkness was softened by the gentle, steady light of his oil lamp. Outside his window, the canal moved with the slow rhythm of the tides. Inside his room, the lamp's flame moved in its ancient dance, casting shadows that flickered and shifted across the walls. Marco's breathing gradually slowed, matching the rhythms around him, the water outside, the city settling into night, the vast and patient continuity of work that would continue tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. There was no need for anything more than this. His work was simple and honest. His life was ordered and purposeful. At 41 years old, with his work-reddened hands and his graying brown hair, Marco had found a kind of peace that did not depend on excitement or change or novelty. It depended only on the faithful repetition of careful, honest work, day after day, season after season, year after year. In this peace, sleep began its patient approach, drawing him slowly down into the deep waters of rest, where all the day's gentle labors could be released and transformed into dreams of grain and water, and the ancient stones of Venice, all of it held in the profound silence of the night. Marco woke in the darkness before dawn as always, but this morning there was something different in the quality of the air. He lay still for several moments, listening, and then he understood it was the sound of rain. Gentle rain, falling steadily against the windows and the stone of the city outside. The sound was soothing, a rhythmic whisper that seemed to deepen the peace of the pre-dawn hours. He rose slowly and dressed, moving through his familiar morning preparations. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows as he made his way through the darkened streets toward the warehouse. The cobblestones were slick beneath his feet, reflecting the faint light of the emerging dawn in small, mirror-like pools. The rain scent was clean and ancient, carrying with it the smell of the lagoon and the stone of the city. The warehouse doors were slightly damp when Marco arrived, and he paused for a moment before entering, allowing the rain to fall on his face and shoulders. The sensation was cool and gentle, and it seemed to ground him in the present moment before he stepped into the familiar space of his work. Inside, the warehouse held a particular quality on rainy mornings. The sound of the rain on the roof created a soft, steady background hum that seemed to intensify the peace of the space. The grain scent, always present, seemed somehow enriched by the moisture in the air, becoming even more complex and subtle. Marco made his way through his morning inspection with even greater care than usual on rainy days. Moisture was the grain merchant's greatest concern, moisture that could lead to mold, to spoilage, to the loss of valuable stores. His graying brown hair was slightly dampened from the rain outside, and he tucked it back absently as he moved along the upper-level rows, checking for any signs of water infiltration or dampness. The roof seemed sound, the building's ancient defenses against the weather appearing to be holding secure. Marco checked the corners and seams with particular attention, running his work-reddened hands along the stone, feeling for any telltale dampness. But the warehouse held firm, as it had through countless rainy seasons before this one. By the time Tommaso arrived, the rain had begun to ease slightly, though it continued to fall in a steady, gentle manner. The apprentice was 19 years old and appeared somewhat uncertain about the change in weather. "Is it safe to work in the warehouse when it rains like this?" Tommaso asked, a slight note of concern in his young voice. "Rain is a part of life in Venice," Marco replied with quiet reassurance. "The warehouse has weathered countless storms. What matters is that we remain vigilant, that we check for any problems, and that we adjust our work accordingly. Today, we will focus on the lower-level stores where the risk of moisture is greatest. We will verify that everything remains dry and secure." Together, they moved through the warehouse, Marco pointing out the particular attention points on rainy days. He showed Tommaso how to check the seals around the door frames, how to test for any subtle signs of moisture infiltration, and how to assess the condition of stored grain for any changes that might indicate exposure to dampness. "The grain itself will tell you if something is wrong," Marco explained, selecting a handful from one of the bins and bringing it to his nose. "When grain has been exposed to excessive moisture, its scent changes. It becomes slightly different, slightly troubled. You develop the ability to detect this change through experience and careful attention." He handed the handful of grain to Tommaso, who sniffed it carefully, trying to understand what Marco meant. "This grain is healthy," Marco continued. "It smells of itself of earth and growth and time. But if grain has been compromised by moisture, it develops almost a sour undertone, a smell of things beginning to break down. Learn to recognize this distinction, and you will be able to prevent many problems before they become serious." The morning progressed in this instructive manner. Despite the rain, merchants still came to purchase grain, though fewer than on the previous day. Each one who entered the warehouse brought the scent of rain with them, and the sound of the weather created a kind of intimacy in the space, as if the warehouse had become a refuge from the storm outside, a place of shelter and order amidst the natural world's wetness and uncertainty. By midday, the rain had become little more than a fine mist, and by early afternoon, it had ceased altogether. The warehouse began to dry, and the quality of the light shifted as the clouds broke apart and pale sun began to filter through them once more. It was during this transition, as the afternoon was emerging from the rain, that a merchant arrived whom Marco had not seen for several years. The man was in his 60s, his face weathered by decades of work in the grain trade. His name was Alessandro, and he had once been one of the most important grain merchants in Venice before gradually reducing his activities as he aged. "Alessandro," Marco said, with genuine pleasure in his voice as he recognized the older merchant. "It has been too long since I have seen you in the warehouse." "Marco," Alessandro replied, extending his hand in greeting. "You are well, I see. You have aged well, my friend. There is more gray in your hair than when we last met, but your eyes remain the eyes of someone who still finds purpose in his work." They clasped hands, and Marco felt a kind of recognition pass between them, the understanding that comes from two people who have spent their lives in the same trade, who understand its rhythms and demands and satisfactions in ways that outsiders could not. "What brings you to the warehouse today?" Marco asked. "I understood you had largely retired from active trading." "I have," Alessandro agreed. "But I had a particular need for a specific grain, and I remembered the quality of your stocks. I am working with a young baker now, and she has particular requirements. I wanted to consult with you about whether you might have what she needs." Marco gestured for Alessandro to sit, and they moved to a quiet corner of the warehouse where they could speak without the distraction of active trading. The rain had cleared enough that sunlight now streamed through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes that drifted through the air in lazy patterns. "Tell me about this baker," Marco said, settling himself into a comfortable listening posture. "What are her needs?" And so Alessandro began to speak, describing a young woman who had recently begun her baking work, who was ambitious and talented but still learning the craft. As he spoke, Marco found himself drawn into the familiar patterns of consultation that had characterized his decades of work. He asked questions, listened carefully to the answers, and gradually began to form a sense of what grain might best serve the baker's purposes. "I believe," Marco said finally, "that I have exactly what she needs. Come with me." He led Alessandro to the middle level of the warehouse, where Marco maintained his finest grain stocks. These were grains that had arrived in excellent condition and had been stored with particular care. They represented the best of what Marco's warehouse had to offer. Marco selected a specific sack and opened it, allowing Alessandro to examine the grain. The older merchant took a handful and examined it carefully, brought it to his nose, assessed its weight and texture with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime in the trade. "This is excellent," Alessandro said after several moments. "This is exactly what the young baker needs. With grain like this, she will be able to produce something truly fine." Marco felt a deep satisfaction at Alessandro's approval. It was the recognition of a peer, someone who understood the value of what he had selected and preserved. "I will measure out what she needs," Marco said. "And Alessandro, because you are a friend of long standing, and because I believe this young baker represents the future of the crafti, will provide this grain at a rate that reflects my appreciation for your judgment in bringing her to me." Alessandro looked slightly surprised, then touched by the offer. "You are generous," he said. "I have always remembered why I respected your work so greatly, Marco. It is because you understand that the grain trade is not merely about commerce. It is about supporting the work of others, about being part of a larger chain of care and craftsmanship. They spent the next hour together, Marco carefully measuring and preparing the grain that Alessandro required. As he worked, the two men spoke of the changes they had witnessed in Venice over their decades in the trade, of merchants they had known who had passed from the world, of the ways that the work had transformed while its essential nature had remained the same. When Alessandro was finally prepared to depart, laden with his sacks of carefully selected grain, Marco walked with him to the warehouse door. "Give my regards to the young baker," Marco said. "Tell her that the grain she receives carries the hopes of those who grew it, those who transported it, and those of us who have preserved it. That legacy of care is woven into every grain." "I will tell her," Alessandro promised. "And perhaps someday she will come to your warehouse herself to understand where her finest grain comes from." After Alessandro departed, Marco found that his mind had been affected by the conversation in a subtle but significant way. The visit from the older merchant, someone who had once been his peer and competitor but whom he had not seen for years, had stirred something in him. It was a reminder that the work extended beyond his own lifetime, that he was part of a continuity that stretched backward and forward through generations. He stood for a long moment in the warehouse entrance, looking out at the city as it emerged from the rain. The cobblestones were still damp, and the air smelled of wet stone and cleansing. The sun was breaking through the clouds more fully now, and light streamed across the rooftops of Venice in golden shafts. Tommaso approached him carefully, as if sensing that Marco was absorbed in thought. "Master Marco," the apprentice said respectfully, "shall I begin organizing the lower-level stores for the evening, or do you have other tasks you would like me to attend to?" Marco turned to look at the 19-year-old young man, seeing in him the same eagerness and careful attention that he himself had brought to his apprenticeship years ago. "Yes, Tommaso," Marco said. "Begin the organization, but first I want to show you something." He led Tommaso to the section of the warehouse where he kept his oldest records, ledgers that stretched back decades. He removed one volume from the shelf and opened it carefully, showing Tommaso pages filled with entries in his own careful handwriting, but also pages in other hands the handwriting of his father, and perhaps even his father's father. "This warehouse," Marco explained, "has been maintaining these records for more than 50 years that I know of, and possibly longer. Each merchant who has worked here, each person responsible for this warehouse, has added to this record. We are not merely conducting daily transactions, Tommaso. We are participating in something much larger than ourselves. We are maintaining a tradition of care and responsibility that will outlast us." Tommaso looked at the ancient ledger with new understanding, his young face growing more thoughtful. "When I am gone," Marco continued, "someone else will take responsibility for this warehouse. Perhaps you, if you continue to show the care and attention you have demonstrated, or perhaps someone who comes after you. Whoever it is, they will find these records, and they will understand that they have inherited not just a building and stocks of grain, but a tradition of faithful work." The rest of the afternoon proceeded in this contemplative mood. Marco and Tommaso completed their work with the same care as always, but there seemed to be something added to the work now a sense that it was part of something larger, something that connected them not only to each other, but to all the merchants and workers who had come before and all those who would come after. As the afternoon light began its inevitable transformation toward evening, Marco found himself moving through the warehouse with a particular kind of presence. He checked each storage area not merely for current problems, but with a sense of stewardship, as if he were a custodian temporarily holding something in trust for others. By the time the evening rounds were complete and Marco and Tommaso stepped out into the Venetian evening, the rain had entirely cleared. The city smelled clean and refreshed, and the stars were beginning to emerge in a sky that had been washed clear by the day's rain. "You did good work today," Marco said to Tommaso. "You learned about the care required on rainy mornings, and you saw how we consult with other merchants and respect their knowledge. These are important lessons." "Thank you, Master Marco," Tommaso replied. "I feel that I am beginning to understand that the work is deeper than I initially realized." "Yes," Marco agreed. "The work is always deeper than it first appears. The surface of it is grain and measurement and record keeping. But beneath that lies something more fundamental, a commitment to care, to reliability, to being part of a larger chain of responsibility." They parted ways, and Marco began his walk home. The evening was cool and fresh after the rain, and the cobblestones beneath his feet were still slightly damp. His work-reddened hands felt the cool air, and his graying brown hair moved gently in the breeze that came from the lagoon. At his modest apartment, Marco prepared his evening meal and settled at his table by the window. He looked out toward the canal, where the water reflected the emerging stars. His mind drifted through the events of the day: the rain, the careful inspection for moisture, Alessandro's visit, and the reminder of connection to past and future, Tommaso's gradual learning and growing understanding. These were the elements that constituted his life. They were simple elements, but they were rich with meaning. At 41 years old, Marco had come to understand that meaning did not require excitement or change or novelty. Meaning lived in the faithful repetition of work done with care, in the understanding that one's actions rippled outward into consequences that extended far beyond one's own lifetime. After his meal, he prepared for sleep. He changed into his sleeping tunic and lay down on his narrow bed, pulling the familiar blanket up around himself. The oil lamp cast its steady light across the room, and outside the window, the night sounds of Venice created a gentle background hum. His breathing slowed, matching the rhythms of the water outside, the city settling into sleep, the vast and patient continuity of work and care that would resume tomorrow. There was no urgency in his mind, no unfinished business requiring attention. The day had been complete, the work had been done faithfully, and tomorrow would bring the same opportunities to bring care and attention to the daily labor that gave his life its shape and purpose. In this state of peaceful completion, Marco drifted down into the deeper waters of sleep, his consciousness gradually releasing its hold on the events of the waking day, sinking into the dream realm where all the careful work of a lifetime could be held in a kind of eternal present, neither past nor future, but simply the timeless rhythm of care and attention and faithful service to work well done. Marco woke to the sound of church bells marking the hour before dawn. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the multiple bells of Venice's churches creating their complex harmony across the water. The sound was familiar and comforting, a reminder that he was part of a vast community, all of them organized around these same temporal markers that divided the day into segments of prayer and work. He rose and dressed as always, his movements economical and practiced. At 41 years old, his body knew the patterns of these mornings so thoroughly that he moved through them almost without conscious thought. Work-reddened hands drew on wool and linen. Graying brown hair was bound back from his face. A leather belt, worn soft by years of use, was fastened around his waist. The morning was clear, with no trace of yesterday's rain. The air was cool and held the particular quality of early autumn, when the season was beginning its slow transition toward winter. Marco noticed this shift as he moved through the streets toward the warehouse. The angle of the light was changing slightly, becoming more acute, and the air held a whisper of the colder months ahead. He arrived at the warehouse to find a merchant already waiting outside the doors. The man was young, perhaps 30 years old, and carried the purposeful bearing of someone engaged in serious business. Marco recognized him as Giacomo, a newer merchant in the grain trade, one who had begun to establish himself over the past few years. "Good morning, Giacomo," Marco said, moving to unlock the warehouse doors. "You arrive early today. What brings you before the sun has fully risen?" "Good morning, Marco," Giacomo replied. "I have a large commission to fulfill, and I wanted to consult with you about grain supplies. I am providing grain for a monastery that is being established in the hills inland. They require substantial quantities, and the quality must be excellent. They have been told that you keep the finest stocks in Venice." Marco felt a quiet pleasure at this recommendation. It was the kind of recommendation that represented the reward of decades of faithful work when other merchants began to associate your name with quality and reliability. "Come inside," Marco said. "Let us examine what I have available." Together, they entered the warehouse, and as they did, Tommaso arrived, somewhat breathless from hurrying through the streets. The apprentice was 19 years old and still possessed the eager energy of youth, though by now he had developed a more confident bearing around the warehouse work. "Good morning, Master Marco," Tommaso said, and then noticed the visitor. "Good morning, Giacomo. I did not know we would have a merchant so early today." "Tommaso," Marco said, "I want you to observe this consultation carefully. What you will see today is an example of how the grain trade extends beyond simple daily transactions. Giacomo is sourcing grain for a significant commission, and this requires knowledge and judgment that extend beyond mere measurement." Over the next hour, Marco took Giacomo and Tommaso on a thorough tour of the warehouse. He showed them the different grain varieties currently in stock, explaining where each had come from, how long it had been stored, what qualities made it particularly suitable for different purposes. "For a monastery," Marco explained, "the grain must be reliable and wholesome. Monks depend on consistent nutrition to maintain their contemplative work. They are not seeking luxury or specialty items, they are seeking grain that will sustain them reliably through the year. What would you recommend, Tommaso? The 19-year-old apprentice considered carefully before responding. The barley from the northern regions, Tommaso said thoughtfully. It is sturdy and reliable, and the wheat that arrived last spring it has aged well and seems to be in excellent condition. Exactly right, Marco confirmed. You are beginning to develop the judgment required for this work. Giacomo, what do you think of Tommaso's recommendation? I think he shows good sense, Giacomo replied. I would make the same choices. They proceeded to select and measure the specific quantities that the monastery commission would require. The work took several hours, as precise measurement was essential for such a significant transaction. Marco involved Tommaso actively in the process, allowing the apprentice to take responsibility for much of the measurement work, while Marco supervised and verified. By midday, the transaction was complete. Giacomo's sacks of grain had been carefully selected, measured, and prepared. Marco had recorded everything meticulously in his ledger, documenting not only the quantities and varieties, but also the destination and intended use. Thank you, Marco, Giacomo said as he prepared to depart. The monastery will be well served by this grain. I wanted them to have the best possible supply, and I knew I could trust your judgment and your stocks. Give them my regards, Marco replied. Tell them that the grain they receive carries with it the hopes of those who grew it and those of us who have preserved it for their use. Monks understand the significance of such stewardship. After Giacomo had departed, laden with his carefully selected stores, Marco turned to Tommaso with a particular kind of satisfaction on his weathered face. This morning, Marco said, you began to see the larger context of the grain trade. A monastery is not merely seeking grain to survive. They are seeking grain that will support their contemplative work, their prayers, their spiritual practice. When you understand this, your work as a grain merchant takes on a different dimension. You are not merely conducting commerce. You are supporting the spiritual life of the community. Tommaso nodded slowly, absorbing this understanding. Master Marco, the apprentice said after a moment, how did you come to understand these things so deeply? It seems that your knowledge goes far beyond what one would learn simply through doing the work. Marco considered the question carefully before responding. He moved toward one of the windows where the afternoon light was now streaming through, creating patterns of illumination on the warehouse floor. When I was 17 years old, Marco began, my father brought me to this warehouse for the first time. He was 38 years old then, and he had already spent more than 20 years in the grain trade. He showed me around the space just as I have shown you, explaining the different grain varieties and the techniques of measurement and storage. Marco paused, his gaze distant, as if he were looking back through time. But what I remember most clearly is something my father said to me on that first day. He said, "The grain teaches you if you let it. Pay attention. The grain will tell you what it needs." For years, I did not fully understand what he meant by this. I thought he was speaking poetically or metaphorically. Marco turned back to face Tommaso directly. But over the decades, he continued, I have come to understand that my father was speaking literally. The grain does teach. It teaches through the way it responds to moisture and temperature. It teaches through the way different varieties serve different purposes. It teaches through the way it connects us to the earth that grew it and to the people who will use it. If you bring sufficient attention to your work, the work itself becomes your teacher. The rest of the afternoon proceeded in this contemplative mood. As merchants came and went, Marco would occasionally pause to point out some detail to Tommaso, a particular quality in a grain sample, a subtle shift in how the stored supplies were settling, a gesture or word choice in how a merchant communicated their needs. By late afternoon, as the light was beginning to shift toward evening, Marco found himself alone in the warehouse for a brief moment. He stood in the center of the main floor, slowly rotating to take in the entire space. The wooden beams that supported the structure seemed to glow in the slanting afternoon light. The stored grain sacks created their familiar landscape of orderly rows and shadows. He thought about Alessandro, whom he had not seen for years until recently, and now they had reconnected. He thought about Giacomo's monastery commission, grain that would travel inland to support the spiritual work of contemplative monks. He thought about Tommaso, 19 years old, gradually learning to see beyond the surface of the work to understand its deeper significance. All of these connections, all of these threads of relationship and work and responsibility, they formed a kind of tapestry that extended far beyond the warehouse itself. Marco was beginning to understand, more fully than ever before, that the grain merchant's work was not isolated. It was fundamentally connected to all the other work that sustained the city and the larger world beyond. Tommaso returned from an errand, and together they completed the final preparations for the evening. The locks were checked, the records were updated, and the space was secured for the night. By the time they stepped out into the Venetian evening, the sun was approaching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber. "You have learned much in the time you have been with me," Marco said to the young apprentice as they stood on the waterside path. "There is still much more to learn. The seasons will teach you things that I cannot merely describe. But I believe you have the temperament for this work. You bring attention and care to your tasks, and these qualities are more important than raw skill or speed." "Thank you, Master Marco," Tommaso replied earnestly. "I am grateful for the opportunity to learn from you. I hope that someday I can serve the trade as faithfully as you have done." They parted ways, and Marco began his solitary walk toward home. The evening was cool, and the light was fading rapidly as autumn darkness came earlier each day. The streets of Venice seemed to slow down at this hour, the urgent commerce of daytime giving way to the quieter rhythms of evening preparation. At his apartment, Marco lit his lamp and prepared a simple meal. He ate slowly, looking out the window toward the canal where the water reflected the emerging stars. His mind was peaceful and contemplative, holding lightly the events of the day without clinging to them or trying to analyze them. After his meal, he prepared for sleep with his usual deliberation. He changed into his sleeping tunic and lay down on his narrow bed. But this evening, rather than immediately drifting toward sleep, Marco lay awake for a time, conscious of the deeper understanding that seemed to be emerging from his work. At 41 years old, he had spent more than half his life in grain warehouses. He had handled countless thousands of sacks of grain. He had measured and recorded and supervised, day after day, season after season, year after year. The work had seemed at first to be simply the accumulation of repetitive tasks. But now he could see that this repetition had created something deeper, a kind of wisdom that arose not from intellectual study, but from the faithful attention to one task, pursued with care across decades. He thought about his father, who had now been dead for more than 20 years. His father had lived most of his life in this same warehouse, had mentored Marco through his apprenticeship, had passed on not merely techniques, but an entire way of understanding the relationship between work and meaning. Marco understood now that his own role included a similar kind of mentorship. He was passing something on to Tommaso, just as his father had passed something on to him. This chain of transmission extended backward and forward through time, connecting him to his father and his father's father, and forward to Tommaso, and whoever might eventually take responsibility after Tommaso. In this understanding, Marco felt himself held within something much larger than his own individual life. His personal story was woven into a much vaster tapestry of work and care and human connection, stretching across generations and extending far beyond anything he could fully comprehend or control. This thought brought him a deep peace. He released his awareness of individual identity for a moment and allowed himself to feel part of this vast continuum. He was simply one thread in an enormous, complex weaving. His life mattered not because of who he was as an individual, but because of how faithfully he had brought his attention and care to the work he had been given. With this understanding settling into him like honey slowly flowing downward, Marco's breathing deepened and slowed. The oil lamp's flame continued its ancient dance in the darkness, casting moving shadows across the walls of his modest room. Outside the window, the water of the canal moved with the rhythm of the tides, indifferent to individual human lives but eternal and constant. The same waters that had witnessed countless merchants and workers across centuries of Venetian history. Sleep came gently, without struggle or resistance, drawing Marco down into the deeper waters of rest where the day's work could be released and transformed. His consciousness drifted through landscapes where grain grew in vast fields beneath eternal summer sun, where water moved in perfect patterns, where the bells of Venice's churches rang their ancient songs across time itself, connecting all those who had ever labored faithfully in service to work done with care and attention. And in this dream state, Marco was at peace, held safe within the vast continuity of work and meaning that extended far beyond his individual life, yet which his faithful labor had helped to sustain and perpetuate. Marco woke to the sound of rain again, though this rain was different from the gentle shower of days before. This was heavier, more insistent, driven by wind that rattled the windows of his modest apartment. He lay still for several moments, listening to the storm, feeling no urgency despite the weather's intensity. Rain was part of life in Venice. The warehouse had weathered countless storms. This one would be no different. He rose and dressed, moving through his familiar morning preparations with the same deliberate care he always brought to them. His work-reddened hands fumbled slightly with the fastenings of his tunic, the cold of the storm, had made his fingers less nimble than usual, but there was no haste in his movements. At 41 years old, Marco had learned that rushing accomplished nothing except to increase the likelihood of mistakes. The streets were mostly empty as he made his way toward the warehouse, the storm having discouraged most early morning travelers. The rain fell in sheets, driven nearly horizontal by the wind, and the cobblestones had become treacherous with water. Marco moved carefully, testing each step, allowing the natural rhythm of cautious movement to set the pace. When he arrived at the warehouse, he found Tommaso already there, waiting beneath the shelter of the entrance, his young face anxious with concern. The apprentice was 19 years old, and storms still carried for him the anxiety that came from relative inexperience. "Master Marco," Tommaso called out as soon as he saw him approaching. "The storm is quite severe. I wondered if we should even attempt to open the warehouse today, or if we should secure everything and wait for the weather to improve." Marco paused to consider the question seriously, respecting the apprentice's concern even as he evaluated the actual situation. The rain was heavy, yes, but the warehouse was built of solid stone. The roof was sound. The doors and windows were secure. "The storm will pass," Marco said calmly, fitting his key into the lock. "Storms always pass. What matters is that we remain vigilant and prepared. Come inside. Together we will check the warehouse carefully, and then we will determine what adjustments, if any, need to be made." They entered the warehouse, and immediately Marco moved to the higher levels where water infiltration was most likely to occur. The sound of the rain on the roof was louder from inside, a constant drumming that seemed to emphasize the shelter the stone walls and wooden beams provided. Marco moved methodically through his inspection, checking corners and seams, looking for any signs of water penetration. Tommaso followed closely, watching and learning, gradually understanding through observation how to assess potential problems. The apprentice's initial anxiety seemed to settle as he realized that the structure was indeed sound, that Marco's confidence in the warehouse's ability to withstand the storm was justified by the building's solid construction. The warehouse was built more than 100 years ago, Marco explained as he worked, his voice calm and informative. The merchants who built it understood what challenges it would need to withstand. They were built with stone and wood that could endure. Storms come and go, but the structure remains. By mid-morning, the rain had begun to ease slightly, though it continued to fall steadily. A few merchants arrived, undeterred by the weather, seeking grain for their various needs. Marco served each one with his usual precision and courtesy, his movements as careful and deliberate as always. One merchant in particular, a woman named Lucia who was 47 years old and operated a flourishing cloth workshop, lingered longer than usual after completing her transaction. "Marco," she said, settling herself on one of the warehouse benches, "I wanted to speak with you about something other than grain. I have been observing your work over the years, and I have come to appreciate not only the quality of your grain, but also the quality of your character. I wanted to ask if you might consider taking on an additional responsibility." Marco waited patiently for her to continue, curious about what she might have in mind. "There is a young merchant," Lucia explained, "a man of perhaps 25 years who has recently lost his father. The father was a grain merchant, and the son wishes to continue the work, but he has no mentor, no one to guide him through the complexities of the trade. I remembered that you took an apprentice some months ago, and I wondered if you might be willing to consult with this young man, perhaps guide him as he tries to establish himself in the trade." Marco considered this request carefully. It represented an extension of his work beyond his own warehouse, a commitment of time and attention that would require him to take responsibility for someone else's development in the trade. "I would be honored," Marco said finally. "Have him come to me. I will do what I can to support his learning." After Lucia departed, Marco found himself reflecting on how his work continued to extend outward in unexpected directions. What had begun as a simple transaction in grain had transformed into a responsibility for mentoring, for passing on knowledge, for supporting the development of the next generation of merchants. The day wore on with the rain continuing its steady fall. By afternoon, the intensity had diminished further, and by late afternoon, the rain had ceased almost entirely, though the sky remained heavy with clouds. The warehouse seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, having successfully weathered the storm without incident. As Marco and Tommaso completed their evening rounds, Tommaso asked a question that revealed how much the apprentice's understanding had developed. "Master Marco," the 19-year-old asked, "when the storms come, does the grain itself change? Does the moisture in the air affect it, even though we keep it sealed away in the warehouse?" "That is an excellent question," Marco replied with obvious approval. "The grain does respond to the moisture in the air. Even sealed away, it is never entirely isolated from the atmosphere of the warehouse. On very damp days, particularly after storms, the grain will absorb some moisture from the air. This is why, after a heavy storm like today's, we would want to monitor the grain carefully over the coming days, watching for any signs that it is beginning to spoil." He led Tommaso to one of the bins and withdrew a handful of grain, allowing the apprentice to examine it. "Feel the texture," Marco instructed. "Today's grain still feels dry and sound, but in a few days, if I detect that moisture has affected it, I would need to make adjustments, perhaps increasing ventilation in certain areas or redistributing grain to allow for better air circulation. This is the ongoing conversation with the grain, the constant attention that maintains its quality." Tommaso held the grain in his palm, feeling its weight and texture, beginning to understand at a deeper level the relationship between the physical environment and the stored supplies. By the time they stepped out into the evening, the storm had entirely passed. The sky was clearing, and the sunset was beginning to emerge through the departing clouds. The light that broke through was particularly golden, enriched by its passage through the moisture-laden air. Marco walked home through streets that were still wet and slick from the day's heavy rain. The city seemed refreshed, as if the storm had cleansed it of some accumulated heaviness. He moved slowly, allowing the evening light and the cooling air to settle into his awareness. At his apartment, he prepared his evening meal as usual: bread and cheese and dried fruit, with weak ale. But this evening, as he ate, he found his mind returning repeatedly to Lucia's request. A young merchant without guidance, learning to navigate the grain trade on his own, struggling with loss. Marco could remember what that had been like, when his own father had died, and he had been left to manage the warehouse largely through his own efforts, supplemented by the advice of other merchants he had come to know over the years. He decided that he would make time for this young man. He would invite him to the warehouse, would show him the fundamentals of the work, and would answer his questions as they arose. It was a responsibility that extended his work beyond the boundaries of his own warehouse, but it was a responsibility that seemed to flow naturally from the decades he had already devoted to this trade. After his meal, Marco settled by his window to watch the evening sky complete its transformation from sunset to deep twilight. The stars were beginning to emerge, and the lagoon waters were growing still as the day's wind departed with the storm. He thought about the chain of transmission that constituted the grain trade. His father had taught him. Now he was teaching Tommaso, and soon he would begin to advise this young merchant who had lost his father. The chain extended backward and forward, each generation passing something on to the next, each person contributing to a continuity that transcended individual lives. At 41 years old, with his work-reddened hands and his graying brown hair, Marco understood himself now not as an isolated individual, but as a link in this vast chain. His meaning did not come from his personal accomplishments or from any sense of individual importance. His meaning came from his faithful participation in this larger pattern, from his willingness to bring his full attention and care to the work that had been given to him, and to pass what he had learned on to those who came after. This understanding brought him a deep peace, the kind of peace that did not depend on external circumstances, but arose from alignment with something larger than oneself. The storm had passed. The warehouse stood sound. The grain remained secure. Tommaso was learning, and now there would be another young man to guide. He changed into his sleeping tunic and lay down on his narrow bed. The oil lamp cast its steady light across the room, and from the window came the gentle sounds of Venice settling into evening, the lapping of water against stone, the distant calls of evening birds, the subtle movement of the city as it prepared for sleep. Marco's breathing gradually slowed, matching these natural rhythms. His consciousness began to release its hold on the waking day, drifting down into the deeper waters of rest. The images that began to form in his mind were peaceful and timeless warehouses and grain, rain and stone, the faces of people he had known across decades, all of it flowing together in a kind of eternal present where all the careful work was being held in a vast web of meaning and connection. In this dream state, Marco moved through warehouses that extended infinitely in all directions, filled with grain of every variety, each sack a kind of story about the earth that had grown it and the hands that had carried it here. And he understood in the wordless way of dreams that he was not alone in these warehouses. He was accompanied by all those who had come before his father, his grandfather, merchants whose names he had never known but whose dedication to faithful work had shaped the tradition he had inherited. And walking beside him in these dream warehouses was Tommaso, and the young man without a father, and countless others who would come in the years and decades and centuries to follow, all of them engaged in the same essential work, all of them bringing their attention and care to the simple act of preserving grain, of supporting life, of maintaining the continuity of human community through faithful, honest work. This was the dream that carried Marco through the night, deeper and deeper into rest, as the rain-washed city around him settled into darkness, and the stars traced their ancient paths across the vast and patient sky. Marco woke before dawn as always, but this morning his body felt heavier than usual. He lay still for several moments, noticing the sensation without alarm. At 41 years old, he had learned to listen to what his body was communicating. This heaviness seemed to be nothing more than the fatigue that came from a storm day, from heightened vigilance and extra attention. It would pass. He rose slowly, moving through his morning preparations with deliberate care. His work-reddened hands moved more slowly than usual as he dressed, but there was no urgency in this slowness. He had learned over the decades that the quality of the day depended not on speed, but on attention brought to each moment. The morning was clear and cool, with no trace of yesterday's storm except for the lingering dampness on the cobblestones. The air smelled fresh and clean, carrying the particular quality of autumn that seemed to promise both the abundance of the harvest and the approaching austerity of winter. When Marco arrived at the warehouse, he found not only Tommaso waiting, but also a young man he did not immediately recognize. The stranger was perhaps 25 years old, with an anxious expression and the bearing of someone who was carrying a significant burden. Lucia's young merchant, Marco realized. "Good morning, Master Marco," Tommaso said respectfully. "This is Giovanni. He came seeking you. I told him you would arrive soon." Marco studied the young man carefully, seeing in his face the recent loss and uncertainty that often characterized those newly responsible for work they had not yet fully learned. "Good morning, Giovanni," Marco said warmly. "I have been expecting you. Lucia spoke to me about your situation. Come inside. We have much to discuss." Together, the three entered the warehouse, and Marco began the work of introducing Giovanni to the fundamentals of the grain trade. He showed the young man around the space, explaining the different storage areas, the varieties of grain, the systems for keeping records. But more importantly, he attempted to communicate something of the spirit with which this work should be approached. "Your father," Marco asked gently, "how long had he worked in the grain trade?" "Most of his life," Giovanni replied, his voice carrying a note of grief and respect. "He began as an apprentice when he was younger than I am now. He devoted himself to learning the trade thoroughly." Then he understood, Marco said, that this work is not merely commercial. It is a form of stewardship. The grain is not merely a commodity to be bought and sold for profit. It is a living thing. It has been grown in soil, nurtured by seasons, harvested and transported and stored. To work with grain is to take responsibility for all of these processes, to ensure that the grain reaches those who will use it in good condition and ready to fulfill its purpose. Giovanni listened intently, and Marco could see that the young man was absorbing not just the words, but the underlying philosophy that shaped them. Over the course of the morning, Marco involved Giovanni in various aspects of the warehouse work. He showed him how to assess grain quality, how to check for signs of spoilage or damage, how to perform the measurement work with precision. Tommaso participated as well, and Marco realized that having another apprentice to guide was actually deepening Tommaso's own learning. The 19-year-old was beginning to see the work from the perspective of a teacher, not merely a student. By midday, a merchant arrived seeking grain for a merchant ship that was being provisioned for a long voyage to distant ports. This was a different kind of transaction from the daily sales to local bakers and brewers. The grain needed to be of a particular quality. It had to remain stable during months at sea, had to resist the moisture and salt air of ocean travel, had to provide consistent nutrition for a crew that would depend on it for sustenance during the voyage. "Watch how we approach this," Marco instructed Giovanni, bringing the young man to examine the particular grain supplies that would be suitable for such a voyage. This is not merely a matter of providing grain. It is a matter of understanding the particular demands of a particular situation and selecting grain that will meet those demands. Together, Marco and Giovanni selected grain from the warehouse's supplies, testing samples for quality, checking the records for how long the grain had been stored, assessing whether the particular variety would travel well. The process took several hours, but it was thorough and careful, and when it was complete, Marco felt confident that the merchant would receive stores that would serve his crew well across the long ocean voyage. After the transaction was complete and the merchant had departed, Marco found himself feeling more fatigued than usual. The morning's intensity had required his full concentration, and now that the work was complete, he became aware of a weariness that seemed to settle into his bones. "Come," he said to Giovanni and Tommaso, "let us rest for a brief time before we complete the afternoon work." The three made their way to the quiet corner of the warehouse where Marco kept a wooden bench. They settled themselves, and Marco began to speak to the two young men about the nature of the work they were learning. "The grain trade teaches patience," Marco began, his voice calm and measured. "It teaches you that good work cannot be hurried. It teaches you to pay attention to details that others might overlook. It teaches you to understand that your actions have consequences that extend far beyond your own immediate circumstances." He paused, looking at the two young faces before him. Tommaso, 19 years old, whom he had been mentoring for months now, and Giovanni, 25 years old, newly responsible for his father's legacy. "But it teaches you something else as well," Marco continued. "It teaches you that your work is part of a larger pattern. When you measure grain carefully and record it accurately, you are not merely conducting a transaction. You are participating in the sustenance of the city. You are supporting the work of bakers and brewers and ship captains and monks and countless others whose work depends on the reliable availability of grain." Giovanni leaned forward, absorbing these words. "My father never spoke of the work in these terms," the young man said thoughtfully. "He spoke of it more practically, measurements and storage and profit margins. But I sensed that there was something deeper in how he approached it, something he perhaps did not have the words to explain." "It is often that way," Marco replied gently. The deeper wisdom of a craft is often communicated not through words but through example, through watching how someone moves through their work, through experiencing the quality of their attention. Your father communicated much to you, I suspect, simply through how he conducted himself in this warehouse. The afternoon proceeded with a kind of ease that Marco found deeply satisfying. The three of them worked together through the routine tasks of the day, checking stores, greeting merchants, updating records. Gradually, Giovanni began to move with more confidence through the space, beginning to understand the patterns and rhythms that characterized the work. By late afternoon, as the light was beginning its transformation toward evening, Marco found a moment to speak with Giovanni alone, while Tommaso was attending to other tasks. Your father was a good man, Marco said to the young merchant. I did not know him well, but I knew of him, and I respected the reputation he had earned. When you take responsibility for his warehouse and his work, you do not need to try to become your father. What you need to do is bring your own full attention and care to the work, and allow the work itself to teach you as it taught him. Giovanni's eyes glistened slightly, with emotion at these words. I am grateful, the young man said. I am uncertain about many things, but your words give me confidence that uncertainty is a natural part of learning. It is, Marco assured him. At 41 years old, with decades of experience in this trade, I still encounter situations that require me to think carefully, to consult with others, to bring my full attention to finding the right approach. The work never becomes simple, but it does become more familiar, and the patterns begin to reveal themselves. As the evening approached, Marco completed his final rounds with a sense of deep satisfaction. The day had been full and rich with teaching and learning. Both Tommaso and Giovanni had shown themselves capable and willing to bring serious attention to the work. The warehouse itself had functioned smoothly, with no problems arising, and all transactions completed successfully. When Marco stepped out into the Venetian evening, he found the city bathed in a particularly beautiful light. The sunset was painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and the air was cool and fresh. He walked home slowly, allowing the evening to settle into his awareness, reflecting on how his work seemed to be expanding in unexpected ways. At his apartment, he prepared his evening meal and ate slowly, looking out the window toward the canal. But this evening, he noticed that his appetite was somewhat diminished. The fatigue that had seemed minor in the morning had not entirely dissipated. He attributed it to the intensity of the day's teaching work and did not concern himself greatly. After his meal, he prepared for sleep with his usual care. He changed into his sleeping tunic and lay down on his narrow bed. The oil lamp cast its steady light across the room, and the evening sounds of Venice drifted through the window. But this evening, sleep did not come as quickly or as peacefully as it usually did. Marco lay awake for longer than usual, aware of a subtle restlessness in his body, a kind of physical uncertainty. He breathed slowly and deliberately, allowing the calm of the evening to gradually settle into him. He thought about the chain of transmission that constituted the grain trade. He thought about his father, dead now for more than 20 years. He thought about Tommaso, 19 years old, gradually developing into a skilled merchant. He thought about Giovanni, 25 years old, attempting to honor his father's legacy while also finding his own path. And he thought about all the grain that had passed through his hands across the decades, all the merchants he had served, all the work that had been performed faithfully and carefully in this warehouse that had stood for more than a century. At 41 years old, Marco understood that he was in the midst of his life's work, not at the end of it. He had perhaps another 20 or 30 years of active work ahead of him, if life permitted. But he also understood, in a way that was difficult to articulate even to himself, that he had already accomplished something significant. He had learned the trade thoroughly. He had brought careful attention to his work across decades. He had begun to transmit what he had learned to the next generation. This understanding brought him a profound peace, deeper than the restlessness that lingered in his body. Whatever came next, whatever time remained to him, it would unfold as it unfolded. His responsibility was simply to bring the same faithful attention to his work that he had brought for all these years. With this thought settling into him, Marco's breathing gradually deepened and slowed. The oil lamp's flame continued its ancient dance in the darkness. The water of the canal moved with the tide's rhythm, and sleep finally arrived, drawing him down into the deeper waters of rest, where all the day's work could be held in a kind of timeless peace. In his dreams, Marco walked through the warehouse at midnight when no one else was present, when the space belonged entirely to itself and to him. In this dream, the grain seemed to glow with a kind of inner light, and he understood in the wordless way of dreams that he was not maintaining the grain. The grain was maintaining him, sustaining not only his body but his spirit, keeping him connected to something vast and ancient and essential. And in this dream, he was not alone. All around him were the figures of those who had come before his father, his grandfather, countless merchants whose names he had never known but whose devotion to this work had woven the tradition he had inherited. And walking with them was Tommaso and Giovanni and countless others who would come after, all of them engaged in the same sacred labor, all of them part of the great chain of care and attention that stretched across generations and time itself. This was the dream that carried Marco through the night, deeper and deeper into rest, as the city around him settled into its own ancient sleep, holding all the lives within it in its vast, patient embrace. Marco woke in the darkness before dawn, but something was different this morning. The heaviness he had noticed the previous day had not dissipated during the night. Instead, it seemed to have settled more deeply into his body, transforming into something that felt almost like weight pressing down on his chest. He lay still for several moments, breathing slowly, assessing what his body was telling him. At 41 years old, Marco had rarely experienced illness. His life of steady work and careful living had kept him generally healthy. But he recognized now that this sensation was not merely fatigue. Something in his body had shifted, had transformed into a state that was not entirely familiar to him. He rose slowly, moving with more deliberation than usual. The simple act of getting out of bed required more concentration. Dressing took longer than it normally did. His work-reddened hands moved more slowly through the familiar motions, and his graying brown hair seemed somehow heavier as he bound it back. By the time he had completed his morning preparations, Marco had made a decision. He would go to the warehouse as usual. The work did not stop merely because he was experiencing some physical discomfort. There were merchants to serve, records to maintain, stores to check. He had responsibilities that extended beyond his own personal circumstances. The walk through the pre-dawn streets seemed longer than usual, as if the distance had somehow increased overnight. But Marco moved steadily, not hurrying, allowing his body to proceed at its own pace. The city was beginning to stir as he arrived at the warehouse, with other early workers making their way through the streets toward their various laborers. When he unlocked the warehouse doors and stepped inside, he found that Tommaso was already waiting, along with Giovanni. The two young men took one look at Marco's face and immediately recognized that something was not entirely well. "Master Marco," Tommaso said with concern, "you do not look entirely yourself this morning. Are you well?" "I am managing," Marco replied, his voice steady even if his body felt less so. "There is some discomfort this morning, but nothing that prevents me from attending work. Come, we will proceed as we normally do." But as the morning wore on, it became increasingly clear to all three of them that Marco's condition was not improving. The simple act of climbing the stairs to the upper levels of the warehouse seemed to exhaust him more than it should have. When he paused to check the grain stores, his hands trembled slightly more than they normally did. By midday, when Lucia arrived at the warehouse on business unrelated to grain, she immediately perceived what was happening. She took one look at Marco and then spoke quietly to Tommaso and Giovanni, instructing them to convince the merchant to rest. "Marco," Lucia said firmly, approaching him where he sat on one of the wooden benches, "you are not well. I can see this clearly. You must go home and rest. Your apprentices are capable of managing the warehouse for one day. You need to attend to your health." Marco wanted to protest, but something in Lucia's authoritative tone, combined with the genuine concern in her voice, penetrated his resistance. He understood that refusing to acknowledge his condition would not serve the warehouse or the young men who depended on him for guidance. "Very well," he said finally. "I will go home. Tommaso, Giovanni, you will manage the afternoon transactions. Remember what I have taught you about precision and care. The merchants will guide you if you have questions." The walk home seemed to take twice as long as it normally did. Marco moved slowly through the streets, aware that his body was no longer responding with its usual reliability. When he reached his apartment, he climbed the stairs deliberately and entered the familiar space of his home. He did not eat. Instead, he lay down on his narrow bed and allowed sleep to take him, a sleep that was deeper and more complicated than the peaceful rest he usually experienced at night. In this sleep, his mind moved through strange landscapes where he was simultaneously in the warehouse and in other places, where time moved in unexpected ways, where the voices of people he had known across his lifetime seemed to speak to him without words. He woke in the late afternoon to find that the light had shifted significantly. His body felt somewhat clearer, though the heaviness remained. He rose slowly and drank some water, realizing that he had gone the entire day without eating. He prepared a small amount of bread and cheese and ate slowly, attempting to restore some sustenance to his depleted body. As evening fell, Marco became aware of a gentle knocking at his door. When he opened it, he found both Tommaso and Giovanni standing outside, their young faces showing genuine concern. "We wanted to ensure that you were managing," Tommaso said respectfully. "The afternoon transactions proceeded as you taught us. We encountered no serious difficulties." "Thank you," Marco replied, genuinely grateful for their care. "Come in, please." The two young men entered, and Marco gestured for them to sit. He remained standing, leaning against the table for support. "I am experiencing a temporary illness," Marco explained, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "It will pass, but I want to speak with you both about something while I have the opportunity to do so clearly." He moved to where his oldest ledgers were stored on the shelf. He withdrew the volume that contained the records spanning more than 50 years, and he opened it to show them the accumulated history of the warehouse work. "This," Marco said, "is the record of the warehouse. It contains the work of my father and my father's work before me, and now my own work. When I am no longer able to maintain this work, one of you will assume that responsibility." Giovanni and Tommaso exchanged glances, understanding the weight of what Marco was communicating. "Tommaso," Marco continued, "you have shown yourself capable and devoted. Giovanni, you carry the legacy of your father's work. Both of you have the capacity to bring faithful attention to this trade. Whichever of you takes responsibility for the warehouse, know that you carry forward something that extends far beyond your own individual life." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts with effort. "The work itself will teach you," he said, repeating the words that his own father had spoken to him more than 20 years before. "If you remain attentive, if you bring care to your labor, the grain will tell you what it needs. The merchants will guide you, the seasons will teach you, and the work will give your life a structure and a meaning that you cannot obtain any other way." After the two young men had departed, Marco lay down on his bed once more. The evening had cooled into night, and the sounds of Venice settling into sleep drifted through his window. He did not light his oil lamp this evening. Instead, he lay in darkness, listening to the water and the distant bells and the settling sounds of the ancient city. His body felt heavy and remote, as if it no longer belonged entirely to him. But his mind remained clear, moving through the events of his life with a kind of gentle contemplation. He thought about his father, who had taught him the trade and had died when Marco was only 21 years old. He thought about the decades that had followed, all the years of faithful work in the warehouse, the merchants he had served, the grain that had passed through his hands. He thought about Tommaso and Giovanni, and about all the young merchants who would come after them, all of them learning the trade, all of them bringing their own unique qualities and perspectives to work that would continue long after Marco himself had departed from the world. At 41 years old, Marco understood that his individual story was not the most important thing. What mattered was that he had participated faithfully in something much larger than himself, something that would continue after he was gone, something that had been sustained across generations, and would be sustained across many more generations to come. This understanding filled him with a profound gratitude. He was grateful for his life, for the opportunity to have worked in the grain warehouse, for the chance to have mentored young men like Tommaso and Giovanni. He was grateful for his father, for the merchants he had known, for the city of Venice itself with all its ancient complexity and beauty. As sleep began to approach, Marco's breathing gradually deepened and slowed. His consciousness began to release its hold on the waking world, drifting down into a state that seemed to be neither sleep nor wakefulness but something in between. In this state, he found himself walking through the warehouse at a time when it seemed to be all times at once. He saw his father working at the measurement bins and his grandfather before him, and countless merchants stretching back through history. And walking with them was Tommaso and Giovanni and many others he did not recognize but who seemed nonetheless familiar to him. And the grain seemed to be everywhere, glowing with a soft luminescence, filling the warehouse with its presence. And Marco understood, in the way one understands things in dreams, that the grain was not merely a commodity or even a means of sustenance. The grain was a kind of connection, a thread that bound all these people together across time, that connected them to the earth that had grown it, to the people who would consume it, to the vast web of human community that depended on faithful work and careful attention to sustain itself. In this dream state, Marco felt himself beginning to dissolve, his individual identity beginning to soften and merge with something much larger. He was no longer Marco, the individual merchant, but rather part of the vast pattern itself, part of the great chain of care and work that stretched across centuries and continents. And this dissolution brought him not fear but a deep and perfect peace. He was being held, he understood, by something infinitely larger and more permanent than his individual life. His personal story was ending, perhaps, but the story itself was continuing, would continue, had always been continuing, would always continue. And in this understanding, Marco finally released his hold on the world, allowing sleep to carry him down into depths that seemed to extend infinitely downward, toward a rest that was more complete and more perfect than any rest he had ever experienced. The oil lamp in his apartment remained unlit through the night. The water of the canal continued its ancient rhythm, indifferent to individual human lives, eternal and patient. The bells of Venice's churches marked the hours of the night with their distant ringing, and in the modest apartment above the canal, Marco lay at peace, his breathing gradually becoming shallower, his grip on individual consciousness gradually loosening, as the night moved through its ancient patterns toward the coming dawn. When Tommaso arrived at the warehouse the next morning, he found that Marco had not come. This was unusual enough that the young apprentice immediately made his way to Marco's apartment. What he found there was the peaceful end of a life lived with faithful attention to work and to the care of others. Marco, 41 years old, with his work-reddened hands and his graying brown hair, had departed during the night. But in departing, he left behind not emptiness but legacy, the warehouse he had tended with such care, the knowledge he had transmitted to his apprentices, the reputation for quality and fairness that would continue to draw merchants to his door for years to come. And most importantly, he left behind Tommaso and Giovanni, two young men who had learned not merely the technical skills of the grain trade, but something far more valuable, the understanding that work could be a form of love, that faithful attention to one's labor could create meaning and connection across generations, that in serving others through one's work, one participated in something sacred and eternal. The grain warehouse would continue. Other merchants would come. Other apprentices would learn. And the chain of transmission would continue forward into a future that Marco would not see, but that he had nonetheless helped to create through the faithful attention he had brought to each day's work across all the years of his life. In the gentle darkness of the night that follows all lives, all work, all stories, peace settles like grain falling slowly from a measured vessel into a waiting container. The work is complete. The warehouse stands secure. And somewhere in the vast continuity of human labor and human care, the legacy continues, will continue, has always been continuing in the faithful hearts of all those who bring their full attention to work done with love. When spring arrived that year, the warehouse stood as it always had, its stone walls weathered and solid against the turning seasons. Tommaso, now moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had grown into his responsibilities, made his morning rounds much as Marco had taught him. The 19-year-old's hands were beginning to show the same reddening that came from years of handling grain, and his movements carried the same unhurried deliberation that had characterized Marco's work. Giovanni had established his own warehouse across the city, honoring his father's legacy while finding his own way in the trade. He came to visit Tommaso on market days sometimes, and the two young men would consult with each other about the challenges of their work, drawing on everything Marco had taught them both. The ledgers remained on the shelf where Marco had kept them, volumes spanning more than 50 years, written in the careful hands of multiple merchants across generations. Tommaso added his own entries to the newest volume with the same meticulous attention that Marco had brought to the work. Each entry was a small declaration of continuity, a statement that the tradition continued, that faithful work persisted. The grain itself seemed to carry something of Marco's presence. When Tommaso held a handful of barley to his nose and closed his eyes, he could almost hear Marco's voice explaining how the grain spoke to those patient enough to listen. The scent of earth and growth and time remained unchanged, a language that had not altered across centuries, that would not alter in the centuries to come. One particular afternoon, when the spring light was streaming through the high windows in golden shafts, Tommaso found himself standing in the center of the warehouse floor, slowly rotating to take in the entire space. The rows of stored grain stretched out in their orderly arrangement. The wooden beams that had supported countless merchants' work seemed to glow in the afternoon light, and Tommaso understood, in a moment of sudden clarity, that he was not merely maintaining this warehouse. He was participating in something eternal, something that had existed before Marco and would exist long after Tommaso himself had departed from the world. This understanding brought him a peace that seemed to settle into his bones like warmth spreading through cold hands. He understood now why Marco had moved through this space with such unhurried grace. It was not because there was nothing urgent to attend to. It was because the work itself had taught him that urgency was not the point. Faithfulness was the point. Attention was the point. Being present to the work, whatever the work required, was the point. Outside the warehouse, Venice continued its ancient patterns. Merchants came and departed. Seasons turned. The water of the lagoon moved with the tides, indifferent to individual human lives, yet somehow eternal in its patient presence. And within the warehouse, the grain rested in its orderly storage, waiting to be measured and distributed, waiting to become bread and sustenance and meaning in the lives of countless people who would never know the names of the merchants who had preserved it. Tommaso picked up his measuring vessel, the same wooden measure that Marco had used, that Marco's father had used before him, and began the work of the afternoon. His movements were steady and careful. His attention was complete. And as he worked, measuring grain and recording transactions, he carried within him the presence of all those who had come before, the knowledge that he was part of a chain that extended far into the past and far into the future. The bells of Venice's churches rang out the hour for Vespers, and Tommaso set aside his work. The day was complete. Everything had been attended to. Everything was as it should be. He stood once more in the center of the warehouse, watching the light continue its slow transformation toward evening. And he felt, in that moment of stillness and completion, the presence of Marco not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living continuity, a presence woven into the very stones and beams of the warehouse, into the grain itself, into the faithful work that would continue as long as there were hands willing to bring care and attention to it. This was Marco's true legacy, not merely a warehouse, though the warehouse would endure, not merely the knowledge he had transmitted, though that knowledge would be passed on to future apprentices and merchants. His true legacy was the understanding he had embodied through his faithful work. That meaning could be found in the simple, careful attention to one's labor. That one's individual life, though brief and limited, could participate in something vast and enduring. That in serving others through one's work, one was connected to the sacred continuity of the human community across all generations and all time. As the evening deepened into night, Tommaso completed his final rounds and prepared to depart. The warehouse stood secure, its doors locked, its stores protected, its records updated. Tomorrow would bring new merchants and new transactions. The day after tomorrow would bring more of the same. And on, the work would continue, as it had continued through Marco's lifetime, as it would continue through Tommaso's lifetime and beyond. And somewhere in the vast, peaceful continuity of faithful work and human care, Marco rested, his labor complete, his legacy secure, his meaning woven forever into the ancient patterns of the city he had served with such quiet devotion. The work endures, the warehouse remains, and the grain, eternal and patient, waits to fulfill its purpose in the hands of those who tend it with faithful attention and careful love.